slideshow. Play from start. All right, I would like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which I am currently presenting on is unceded indigenous lands that belong to the Kanien'kehá:ka Nation. I respect the continuing connections with the past, present, and future in our ongoing relationships with indigenous and other peoples within the Montreal community. So at first glance, cartography and mythology might seem diametrically opposed. Maps show us our location in respect to landmarks and boundaries, but myths also give us a grander view of the world, orientating the individual within society and ordering the chaotic cosmos. And yet, for as long as we've been human, we've been imagining about what exists beyond the boundaries of our familiar world. We imagined predatory beings, incredible wonders in places like deep woods, rough waters, infinite skies, and, for this presentation, at blank edges. So, despite being from two undeniably different traditions, both the 16th century European and indigenous Mesoamerican incorporate the monstrous into their maps and encode myths into the structure of their empirical world. However, few studies have addressed these in relation to each other. So that's what this presentation is about. I will be examining 3 maps of the Central Basin of Mexico to illustrate how 2 vastly different traditions used myth to make very real impacts on the lands they were depicting, and how these maps themselves express socio-political ideologies. In other words, making these maps was a way of making their world. So just for brevity, myths are often thought of as being a synonym for falsity. However, that's a very relative label, as only other people have myths, because obviously the stories we tell about ourselves, their history, they're true, which is itself a characteristic of myths. So it's important to realize that also these stories have a purpose. The origin myth, the cosmogony, literally means the story of the ordering of the universe. And by retelling how the world came to be, the audience is also participating in recreating the world in their minds. So the dominant tribes of the Aztec Empire illustrated epic accounts of their arrival to the Central Basin through the folios of codices. These codices aren't like normal books that we would think of. There's no discrete conversion between symbol and syllable that would allow images to be read like a text. There is an order of procession from one page to the next, but each page is also considered in and of its own. So I will be focusing on 2 codices, the Conquistadors, which traces the history of the Chichimecs from their arrival at Texcoco in the 13th century, and the Codex Azteclan, which depicts the migration of the Mexica from the mythic valley of Aztlan to Tenochtitlan, and their subsequent conquering of the previously mentioned Chichimec. So, in the cultures of Mesoamerica, in a very loose and grand scheme, the universe consisted of 3 worlds. There was the middle world, the upper world, and the underworld. And the middle world is where the humans live. This middle world was also divided into 4 quarters, with the 4 corners of this world being held up by Bekabs, the 4 gods of rain and wind. The famous frontispiece from the Codex Meyer is a diagram of Bekabs over here. And yet, the Codex is presented more as a landscape. So the reason for this is that Mesoamerica simply didn't attribute the cardinal directions with the same importance as the Europeans did, and didn't use them for describing their immediate landscape. Rather, their focus was more on following the path of the sun and the planet Venus, the celestial bodies that held the greatest mythological importance in their stories. So by tracing these across the arc of the sky, they mapped their world along with the primary east-west axis. So to translate this into a map, they presented a landscape, a view that's read across the page as one would observe the sun passing across the sky. And these 3 worlds were not divided by an impenetrable veil. Spirits, gods, and monsters were everywhere, whether you could see them or not. And this is more evident in the Codex Aztlan, where the hills themselves rear up as a spotted jaguar, maw gasping and claws reaching from the depths. And there are gods along the landscape as well, most importantly, Huitzilopochtli, the hummingbird god of war, which serves as a guide to the Mexica in the Codex Aztlan, sometimes taking an active role in this journey and other times as a passive overseer. In the Conquistadors, which I've blown up here, here he is, along with his people. This is actually the Mexica lord Ximalpoca, who dons the disguise of the god, but itself, he still appears in being. So the Conquistadors explicitly acts as a document of political legacy in the Texcoco Valley by depicting the wanderings as an ordered series of sites and bloodlines. Eduardo Douglas notes that through this map, the patron, quote, established its historical genesis and thereby the legitimacy of the royal family and its claims in an insistently indigenous format, end quote. The Nahua in the Central Basin claimed descendants from the Chichimecs of the northern deserts. And the Chichimecs themselves said they came from the mythic city of Tolon in the east. So both these narratives accumulate in their transformation into a new ethnic group with the founding of their capital, as displayed through the maps. So we can see that these maps were not very functional in the way that Google Maps is today, but rather a visual addition to an oral history tradition. Through the ritual of reading and recitation of their mythic migration, they were able to walk those same footsteps along their long-gone forebears. This adds the aspect of time, which is a central cosmological concept, into the landscape itself. The viewer is engaged with historic migration by its recreation across the page before them, their eyes marching along with the figures of their ancestors. By reading this map, we're repeating a moment in time, collapsing the past and the present in a moment of recreation. On the other hand, in the late 15th century and 16th century, some men were driven to push the boundaries of knowledge in the European world, for God, for glory, and for gold. And when they returned from the territory of the Triple Alliance, they brought back stories of marvelous flora and surreal landscapes inhabited by uncanny monsters. Though there are at least 7 maps dating to the 1530s, I will only be looking at the Cortez map here. It was sent as an addition to a letter to the monarchs of Spain to report Cortez's endeavors. It was proof of first-hand experience to the new continent, as well as a material record of his presence within this momentous narrative of history. It was later published in Nuremberg, and it would be the first picture Europeans had of the Cholula Mexica city. And when we look closer at it, we see that it's not just this plan of a city, but a framework for imperialism and plans of domination. The Cortez map, given its European author, is more easily recognized to us today as what we would think of as a typical map. We're presented this view from above, looking down through a fish eye. The city is presented as a disk of land floating in Lake Texcoco. And I will admit, although the built island of Tenochtitlan was round in plan, the lake is far from regular, as we can see over here. It stretches out quite a bit. But this view of the city makes it look like a world unto itself. And although some scholars have argued that this point of view is an indigenous perspective, as I've just presented, that's not the case. So Cortez was rather drawing upon an earlier tradition called Mappamundi. And at the center of every European Mappamundi is Jerusalem. So one might wonder why this staunchly Catholic Cortez would place the heart of the pagan worship, aka the Templo Mayor, at the center of his map of Tenochtitlan. Well, when we interpret this through a conquistador lens, the map suggests that Tenochtitlan is a second Jerusalem in need of crusade to free it from the savage, unworthy possession of indigenous people. The early modern period inherited this captivation with the unseen others that their imagination filled in. And we have a natural instinct to fear what we do not know. The Spanish arrival at the Americas did little to dissuade those fears. Out there be sea monsters and unforgiving waters. Out there were forces of nature that had a will of their own. Out there were people who did not follow the norms of society, covered in ochre and shimmering feathers. And the only way to bring them into the realm of control was to document them on the edge as warnings. But when we look at the Cortez map, again, the monsters are not at the edges, but in the ceremonial heart of the city. For all the gold that they were looking for, there was also gore to their eyes. So when you look at the map, it's so small that you might just mistake it for a statue, but statues don't bleed, as we see over here. Instead, we see a disarticulated corpse at the foot of the Templo Mayor. So Cortez was defying typical practice by placing the monstrous at the steps of the Templo Mayor instead of at the edges of the city. Because you see, this city, was the edge of the map. And the monster most commonly associated with these horrid lands was the man-eater, as Columbus labels them the cannibal. But this is a change in terminology from the anthropophagy, which means literally human eaters. Because cannibal categorized the eaters as non-humans who ate their own kind, thereby questioning the very humanity of the indigenous persons that they were encountering. And this leads into how the Europeans were constructing their maps as an idea of binaries. Their cosmos was set as an us versus them. Cortez's encounter with a blatantly un-Christian population set the precedent that the indigenous people needed to be saved through the light of the church. The Spanish were therefore justified in invading a sovereign empire because it was a task set to them by their God. Cortez also applies this didactic schema to himself by pitting himself, viewing from the higher ground of heaven in the fisheye, as opposition to the cannibals at the heart of the city. He presents himself as the noble man who stands over the bloody cannibal, the crusader who has captured the New Jerusalem for the glory of Spain. Thus, this is not just a map of the city, but a whole path to annex land, a testament to one's man prowess, and the definition of the Christian in opposition to the savage. So Douglas then warns that, quote, however faithful, every reproduction or copy of an earlier image or text is at least partially motivated by a need or desire felt in the present, in which the patron and or artist chose to commission or produce it, end quote. So we have to ask, what is the purpose of these maps, of these myths? And oftentimes they serve many purposes at once. We can't look at maps as if they're nothing more than pretty pictures of the world. We have to ask several questions. Who made this? Who is it for? What is shown and how do they show it? What is not shown and what does the absence of that mean? How is this used? So these maps are less about navigation and more about diagramming the world with an intersection of several ideologies, religious, political, and genealogical. These visions are both constructed narratives and true visions, true depictions of the world around them. Encoded in each is the presence of gods, monsters, and the inhumane. Each map serves to show what is out in the world. They tell us what we are to see and how we are to see it, because neither art nor myths nor maps are mere reflections of reality. They are canvases by which the world was built and rebuilt to maintain verisimilar according to the audience. To map the land was itself an act of conquest. So they entwined myth with ink to show what they believed to exist and how they ruled over it. It was a way of understanding and as a way of conquering. Thank you.